The morning of March 8, 1944, at Royal Air Force Station Rackheath in Norfolk, England, ground crews watched a formation of B-17 flying fortresses materialize through the low clouds, their engines coughing and sputtering as they descended toward the runway. The lead aircraft, designated Hell's Angel, came in steep and fast, far faster than regulation approach speed. No flaps extended from the trailing edge of its wings. The aluminum skin along the port wing looked like Swiss cheese, punctured by hundreds of holes from German 88mm flak shells that had detonated over Bremen 2 hours earlier. The pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Vance, had no choice. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The hydraulic lines controlling his wing flaps had been severed by shrapnel at 23,000 feet. Fragments of the same burst had wounded his ball turret gunner and knocked out his No. 3 engine. Now, with fuel running low and the English coastline behind him, he had one chance to get his crew of 9 men home alive. The book said a B-17 landed at 110 miles per hour with full flaps deployed. Vance was coming in at 140 miles per hour with nothing but raw airspeed, propeller pitch, and the massive wings of a Boeing B-17G to keep 36,000 pounds of bomber from smashing into the Norfolk farmland. What happened next would become routine for thousands of bomber pilots by the summer of 1944. But in March, with the strategic bombing campaign reaching its crescendo and German flak batteries multiplying across every major target in the Reich, pilots were discovering that the emergency procedures buried in their training manuals weren't academic exercises. They were survival skills. And the question facing every bomber crew returning from the increasingly lethal skies over Nazi Germany wasn't whether they would take battle damage. It was whether they could still fly when they did. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress represented the pinnacle of American strategic bombing doctrine in 1943. Designed in the mid-1930s as a long-range heavy bomber capable of defending itself while delivering precision ordnance deep into enemy territory, the B-17 had evolved through 7 major variants by the time the G model entered production in 1943. It carried a crew of 10 mounted 1350 caliber machine guns and could theoretically haul up to 8,000 pounds of bombs to targets across occupied Europe. The aircraft's reputation for ruggedness was well earned. Its wing design featured heavy truss-type spars that tended to localize battle damage, preventing a single hit from compromising the entire wing structure. The redundant control systems meant pilots could fly the aircraft even with significant portions of the tail surfaces shot away. Stories circulated through 8th Air Force bases in England about B-17 seconds returning with engines destroyed, tails shredded, and massive holes in the fuselage large enough for a man to climb through. Wally Hoffman, a B-17 pilot with the 8th Air Force, captured the sentiment shared by thousands of his fellow aviators. The plane can be cut and slashed almost to pieces by enemy fire and bring its crew home. But ruggedness and invulnerability were not the same thing, and by early 1944, American bomber crews were learning the difference at a terrible cost. The problem wasn't enemy fighters, though Luftwaffe interceptors remained deadly throughout 1943. By early 1944, the introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts had begun to shift the balance of air superiority over Europe. German fighter pilots who had once attacked bomber formations with relative impunity now found themselves fighting for their lives against American fighters that could follow the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The problem was flak, German Flugabwehrkanone, anti-aircraft artillery. Specifically, the 88mm guns that had become the backbone of German air defense. These weapons could fire up to 25 rounds per minute, with shells fused to detonate at specific altitudes. When an 88mm shell exploded, it created a sphere of jagged steel fragments traveling at lethal velocity in all directions. A single round detonating close to a bomber could punch hundreds of holes through aluminum skin, sever control cables, rupture hydraulic lines, and kill or wound crew members. By the summer of 1944, flak accounted for approximately 2/3 of all American heavy bomber losses over Europe and 98% of aircraft damaged. Between June and September of 1944, Between 3,360 and 4,453 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds returned to English bases with flak damage every single month. That averaged roughly 120 bombers damaged per day during peak operations. The mathematics were sobering. In October 1943, 3/4 of all bombers on a single raid suffered some form of flak damage. The German guns ranged from 20mm autocannon to massive 128mm pieces, but the most common and most feared was the 88mm gun. It was deadly accurate, could reach altitudes where bombers operated, and existed in vast numbers throughout the Reich. General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, stated in late March 1945 that flak was the biggest factor affecting bombing accuracy. The Luftwaffe had learned what many military historians would later confirm. The primary job of anti-aircraft artillery wasn't necessarily to shoot bombers down. It was to force them higher, break up their formations, damage their aircraft, and make precision bombing impossible. Bombers killed were a bonus. Bombers damaged and forced to abort were nearly as valuable, and bombers that completed their missions with shredded control surfaces, wounded crews, and punctured hydraulic systems still represented a victory for German air defense because those aircraft consumed resources, required repair, and reduced the number of bombers available for the next mission. The impact on bomber crews was both physical and psychological. Flight surgeons reported that bomber crews suffered from insomnia, irritability, sudden temper flashes, nausea, weight loss, blurred vision, inability to concentrate, and Parkinson's-like tremors after repeated missions over heavily defended targets. Flak was inescapable. Fighter pilots could maneuver, dodge, fight back against an opponent they could see. Bomber pilots flew straight and level through flak batteries during the bomb run, watching black puffs of smoke materialize around them, feeling the aircraft shudder when shrapnel tore through the fuselage, knowing that any one of those bursts might be the one that killed them. And increasingly, the damage those bursts inflicted was concentrated in specific areas of the aircraft. Wings, with their large surface area, presented an obvious target. Control surfaces, hydraulic lines, fuel tanks, and electrical systems all ran through the wings. A well-placed burst could sever the cables controlling the ailerons, puncture fuel tanks and create fire hazards, or destroy the hydraulic lines that operated the wing flaps. Wing flaps on a B-17 were critical for normal landing operations. These split flaps, mounted on the trailing edge of the wings inboard of the ailerons, could extend to 45 degrees. When deployed, they increased drag and changed the wing's camber, allowing the aircraft to fly at slower speeds without stalling. A normal landing approach in a B-17 called for full flaps, reducing approach speed to approximately 110 miles per hour. This gave pilots better control during the critical moments before touchdown and reduced the landing roll significantly. Without flaps, the physics changed dramatically. The aircraft had to maintain much higher airspeed to avoid stalling, typically 140 miles per hour or more on final approach. Higher approach speed meant less time to react to problems, a longer landing roll, and significantly more stress on the landing gear and brakes. It also meant less margin for error. A pilot who misjudged his altitude or approach angle at 140 miles per hour had far less time to correct than a pilot flying a stabilized approach at 110 miles per hour. The procedures existed in the technical manuals. Army Air Forces Manual 50-13, the official pilot training manual for the B-17 Flying Fortress, included a section on emergency procedures. No flap landing appeared in the list, along with 3-engine landing, 2-engine landing, and other contingencies that pilots hoped never to encounter. The instructions were straightforward: maintain higher airspeed, plan for a longer landing roll, use caution with braking, but reading about an emergency procedure in a manual and executing it with a battle-damaged aircraft, low on fuel, with wounded crew members aboard, after 10 hours in combat conditions at -50 degrees Fahrenheit, represented entirely different propositions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The manual couldn't capture the reality of bringing 36,000 pounds of aluminum, engines, and ordnance back to Earth at 140 miles per hour, with nothing but skill and hope to cushion the impact. By late 1943, bomber pilots across the 8th Air Force were discovering that emergency procedures were becoming standard operating procedures. Missions that should have been routine were becoming damage assessment exercises. Aircraft that should have landed normally were instead screaming in hot and fast with battle damage that made textbook approaches impossible. The Battle of Berlin, which began in November 1943 and continued through March 1944, illustrated the scope of the problem. Deep penetration raids into the German capital required bombers to fly through some of the most heavily defended airspace in human history. German flak batteries ringed every approach to Berlin. Luftwaffe fighter units, though increasingly outnumbered, fought with desperate determination. The losses were staggering. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched a maximum effort raid against Berlin involving 672 heavy bombers. 69 aircraft were shot down, a loss rate of slightly over 10%, but the damage statistics told an even more disturbing story. Of the bombers that returned to England, more than 400 showed battle damage. Some carried wounded or dead crew members, some limped home on 3 engines, or 2 engines, or in one documented case, a single functioning engine, and many returned with hydraulic systems destroyed by flak. No hydraulic pressure meant no normal flap operation. The emergency hand crank system could extend flaps manually, but only if the hydraulic lines themselves weren't severed. If shrapnel had cut the lines, the hydraulic fluid drained away, and the flaps became nothing more than dead weight. Pilots had no choice but to bring their aircraft in without them. First Lieutenant Robert Vance, approaching RAF Rackheath on March 8, represented one of dozens of pilots facing identical circumstances that single day. His hydraulic pressure gauge read 0. The hand crank for emergency flap extension sat useless in the radio compartment because there was no fluid in the system to operate the actuators. His number 3 engine had been feathered. The propeller blades turned into the wind to reduce drag. His ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, had taken shrapnel in his legs and was being tended by the waist gunners, and his fuel gauges showed less than 200 gallons remaining in his tanks, barely enough for one approach. There would be no go-around, no second chance. Vance ran the numbers in his head. The B-17G weighed approximately 36,000 pounds at his current fuel state. Without flaps, he needed to maintain 140 miles per hour until he was certain he could make the runway. The runway at Rackheath measured 6,000 feet, long enough for a normal landing with plenty of margin, but marginal for a hot approach with a heavy aircraft. His brakes, if they still worked with the damaged hydraulic system, would be critical for stopping before he ran out of runway. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant William Harris, worked the radio, coordinating with the tower. Ground crews had been alerted. Crash crews stood by with fire trucks and ambulances. The runway was clear. Vance had priority for landing, but all the preparation in the world couldn't change the fundamental physics of what he was about to attempt. The B-17's stall speed without flaps was significantly higher than with flaps deployed. The manual provided figures for various configurations, but those figures assumed clean wings, full power available, and no battle damage. Vance's port wing had been shredded by flak. Hundreds of holes disrupted the smooth airflow over the wing surface. His number 3 engine was dead, creating asymmetric thrust. His number 2 engine was running rough, the cylinder head temperature gauge showing numbers in the yellow arc. Everything about this approach violated the textbook assumptions. He crossed the runway threshold at 145 miles per hour, fast enough to ensure he wouldn't stall, slow enough that he might be able to stop. The runway rushed up to meet him. Harris called out altitude. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. Vance eased back on the control yoke, bleeding off airspeed, feeling for the ground. The main wheels touched with a screech of rubber. The tail settled. Vance stood on the brakes. The aircraft shuddered, tires smoking, momentum fighting, friction. They stopped with less than 1,000 feet of runway remaining. Hell's Angel had survived another mission. What Vance accomplished that morning was neither unique nor particularly remarkable by the standards of 1944. Across dozens of airfields in England that same day, similar scenes played out. Damaged bombers came in hot and fast. Pilots compensated for missing control surfaces, dead engines, and destroyed hydraulic systems. Ground crews rushed to meet aircraft the moment they stopped rolling, extracting wounded men, assessing damage, beginning the process of repair or salvage. The remarkable thing wasn't that pilots like Vance could execute flapless landings. The remarkable thing was how quickly it had become necessary for them to learn, and how little time the Army Air Forces had given them to prepare for this new reality. When the strategic bombing campaign against Germany began in earnest in 1943, American doctrine assumed that heavily armed bomber formations flying at high altitude could penetrate enemy airspace, deliver precision ordnance, and return with acceptable losses. The doctrine had been developed in peacetime, refined through theoretical exercises, and codified in training manuals that assumed certain conditions would remain constant. One of those assumptions was that aircraft would return from missions either intact or destroyed. The doctrine accounted for mechanical failures, navigation errors, and weather-related incidents. It planned for fighter opposition and acknowledged that some percentage of aircraft would be shot down, but it fundamentally underestimated the cumulative effect of battle damage on bomber operations. The training pilots received stateside prepared them to fly the B-17 under normal conditions. They learned formation flying, instrument procedures, navigation, and bombing techniques. They practiced emergency procedures for engine failures, fires, and loss of control surfaces. But the teachers, training, conducted in aircraft that hadn't been shot at, couldn't replicate the chaos of combat operations. Flight training in the B-17 typically began at bases like Hendricks Field in Sebring, Florida, or Hobbs Army Airfield in New Mexico. Student pilots learned to handle the big four-engine bomber, practiced takeoffs and landings, and gradually built proficiency. The aircraft was complex but manageable. Its controls were heavy but responsive. Its engines were powerful and reliable. Its systems were redundant and well-designed. Then these pilots arrived in England, flew their first combat mission, and discovered that the aircraft they thought they knew became something entirely different when pieces of it were missing. A B-17, with all four engines running, intact control surfaces, and functioning hydraulic systems, flew exactly as advertised in the manual. A B-17, with an engine shot out, holes in the wing, and severed hydraulic lines, flew like a completely different aircraft. And the manual hadn't prepared pilots for that reality. The technical order manuals provided some guidance. Army Air Forces, Technical Order, AN0120EG1. The pilot's flight operating instructions for the B-17G included emergency procedures. The section on abnormal landings covered various scenarios: 3-engine landing, 2-engine landing, no-flap landing, crash landing, emergency evacuation. Each section provided basic instructions, but they were necessarily generic. The manual couldn't account for every possible combination of battle damage. A no-flap landing procedure in the technical order specified: maintain higher approach speed, plan for longer landing roll, exercise caution with braking. Those instructions were accurate but insufficient. They didn't explain how to judge the approach when holes in the wing disrupted airflow and made stall speed unpredictable. They didn't describe how to compensate when one engine was dead and another was running rough. They didn't address the psychological challenge of bringing a damaged aircraft in fast, knowing that any mistake would likely be fatal. Pilots learned these things the hard way. They learned by watching other pilots attempt flapless landings. They learned by debriefing with crews who had survived difficult approaches. They learned by studying accident reports of aircraft that hadn't made it. And most importantly, they learned by doing it themselves, often with no advance warning that their flaps wouldn't work until they tried to extend them on final approach. The hydraulic system on the B-17 operated at approximately 800 pounds per square inch when functioning normally. This pressure operated not only the wing flaps, but also the cowl flaps that regulated engine cooling and the brakes that stopped the aircraft after landing. The system included an electric pump, a hand pump for backup, an accumulator to store pressure, and miles of hydraulic lines running through the wings and fuselage. When German 88mm shells detonated near a bomber, the fragments travelled outward in a roughly spherical pattern. The fragments were irregular pieces of the shell casing, jagged and sharp, propelled by the explosive force. They could punch through aluminum skin, sever cables, and rupture hydraulic lines with ease. A single shell burst in the right location could destroy multiple systems simultaneously. The B-17's hydraulic lines were particularly vulnerable because they ran through the wings, which presented the largest surface area to flak bursts below. A shell burst beneath the wing could send fragments upward through the lower wing surface, through the hydraulic lines, and out through the upper surface. The result was catastrophic loss of hydraulic pressure. When hydraulic pressure dropped to zero, several things happened. First, the pilots would notice the gauge on the instrument panel reading 0 and a red warning light illuminating. Second, they would find that operating any hydraulically powered system required using the emergency hand pump, which was slow and physically exhausting. Third, they would discover that if the hydraulic lines themselves were severed, pumping the hand pump did nothing because the fluid simply drained out through the holes in the lines. For wing flaps specifically, the loss of hydraulic pressure meant no flap extension unless the emergency hand crank system could be employed. The hand crank was located in the radio compartment, accessible through a floor panel aft of the bomb bay. Operating it required removing the stored hand crank and extension from their stowage location, inserting the crank into its receptacle, and manually turning it to extend the flaps. Under ideal conditions, this process took several minutes and required significant physical effort. Under combat conditions, with wounded crew members, in aircraft potentially damaged in other ways, while preparing for landing, the process became far more difficult. And if the hydraulic lines were cut, the process became impossible because there was no fluid in the system to move the actuating cylinders, even if the hand crank could position the control mechanism. Pilots quickly learned to assess their hydraulic system status during the flight home from the target. If hydraulic pressure read 0, or if they had reason to believe the lines were damaged, they began preparing for a no-flap landing long before reaching the English coast. This preparation included several steps. First, they would advise the crew of the situation. Every man aboard needed to know they would be making a high-speed landing and should prepare accordingly. Wounded crew members needed to be secured in positions where they could withstand a potentially rough touchdown. Loose equipment needed to be stowed or jettisoned. Second, they would select an airfield with the longest possible runway. The standard B-17 bases in East Anglia had runways ranging from 5,000 to 7,000 feet. For a normal landing with full flaps, 5,000 feet provided adequate margin. For a no-flap landing, pilots preferred 6,000 feet or more if available. Third, they would calculate their fuel state and determine whether they had enough fuel for a safe approach. A normal approach with flaps allowed the aircraft to descend at a controlled rate while maintaining relatively low airspeed. A no-flap approach required maintaining higher airspeed throughout the descent, which consumed more fuel. Pilots needed to ensure they had sufficient fuel to reach the airfield and execute the approach without running the tanks dry. Fourth, they would coordinate with the tower and ground crews. Controllers needed to know that an aircraft was coming in with no flaps, both to provide priority landing clearance and to alert crash crews. The fire trucks and ambulances would position themselves near the runway. The tower would clear other traffic from the pattern. Everything possible was done to give the damaged aircraft the best chance of landing successfully. Then came the approach itself. The pilot would position the aircraft on a long final approach, giving himself maximum time to stabilize the airspeed and descent rate. The target airspeed was typically 140 to 150 miles per hour, significantly faster than the 110 miles per hour used for normal landings. This higher speed provided margin above stall speed, given that battle damage to the wings might have increased the actual stall speed beyond the published figures. The descent rate needed careful management. Too steep a descent would require too much altitude loss, potentially putting the aircraft below the glide path where recovery would be impossible. Too shallow a descent would leave the aircraft high on approach, forcing the pilot to either slip the aircraft to lose altitude or go around and try again, both of which consumed precious fuel. Power management became critical. Unlike a normal approach where the pilot could reduce power significantly once established with flaps extended, a no-flap approach required maintaining substantial power to sustain the higher airspeed. The pilot needed to balance thrust against drag, maintaining just enough power to hold the desired airspeed while allowing the aircraft to descend toward the runway. The biggest challenge came in the final moments before touchdown. With flaps extended normally, a pilot could reduce power to idle, allow the aircraft to settle onto the runway at a relatively low speed, and apply brakes gently to stop within a reasonable distance. Without flaps, the process became far more demanding. The pilot had to judge exactly when to begin reducing power. Too early, and the aircraft would decelerate rapidly, potentially stalling before reaching the runway. Too late, and the aircraft would touch down with excess speed, consuming enormous amounts of runway before stopping. The correct technique involved reducing power gradually during the final 100 feet, allowing airspeed to bleed off while maintaining enough energy to reach the runway. Touchdown itself occurred at significantly higher speed than normal. Where a normal landing saw the main wheels contact the runway at perhaps 80 to 90 miles per hour, a no-flap landing touched down at 120 miles per hour or more. This higher speed created several problems. First, it generated much more kinetic energy that had to be dissipated through braking. The kinetic energy of a moving object increases with the square of velocity, meaning that landing at 120 miles per hour instead of 90 miles per hour didn't just increase energy by 33%, it nearly doubled it. The brakes, which might already be compromised by battle damage to the hydraulic system, had to work much harder. Second, the higher touchdown speed reduced the pilot's reaction time. Events happened faster. If something went wrong, the pilot had less time to respond. A blown tire that might be merely inconvenient during a normal landing could become catastrophic at 120 miles per hour. Third, the longer landing roll increased the probability of running out of runway. Even on a 6,000-foot runway, landing long or failing to stop quickly could result in the aircraft departing the prepared surface and potentially striking obstacles beyond the runway end. Despite these challenges, pilots mastered the technique through necessity and practice. By the summer of 1944, no-flap landings had become common enough that they no longer merited special mention in mission reports unless combined with other significant damage. Pilots who might have viewed such a landing as a harrowing emergency in late 1943 treated it as merely another difficult day at the office by mid-1944. The statistics reflected this adaptation. Between June and August 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 341 aircraft to flak with a staggering 10,972 damaged. Of the damaged aircraft, approximately 27% were deemed serious, meaning they required extensive repair before returning to service. Many of these seriously damaged aircraft had hydraulic system failures requiring emergency landing procedures. Yet despite the enormous number of damaged aircraft and the frequency of hydraulic failures, the accident rate during landing remained relatively low. Pilots were successfully bringing home aircraft that should have, by any reasonable assessment, been unflyable. They were executing emergency procedures that many had never practiced in training. They were adapting to circumstances that the doctrine hadn't anticipated. This adaptation represented more than just individual pilot skill. It represented a systematic evolution in how the Army Air Forces approached bomber operations. The lessons learned in combat were being rapidly integrated back into training pipelines. Replacement pilots arriving in England by mid-1944 received much more comprehensive emergency procedure training than their predecessors had received in 1943. Training bases in the United States began incorporating battle damage scenarios into their curricula. Instructors who had completed combat tours shared their experiences with student pilots. The technical order manuals were revised to include more detailed guidance on handling damaged aircraft. The institutional knowledge that had been paid for in blood over Germany was being preserved and transmitted to the next generation of bomber pilots. The engineering departments at Boeing and the Army Air Force's Materiel Command also responded to the reality of combat operations. While major redesigns of existing aircraft were impractical, modifications could be and were implemented. Redundant hydraulic routing was added where possible. Critical hydraulic lines were repositioned or armored. Emergency extension systems were improved. The B-17G model, which began production in mid-1943, incorporated several changes specifically designed to address vulnerabilities identified in combat. But no amount of engineering could eliminate the fundamental problem that wings presented large targets and hydraulic systems could be destroyed by battle damage. The solution wasn't technological, it was procedural and cultural. Pilots simply had to become proficient at flying and landing damaged aircraft. The psychological dimension of this adaptation deserves examination. The first time a pilot executed a no-flap landing with a battle-damaged aircraft, it was likely terrifying. The higher speeds, the unfamiliar handling characteristics, the knowledge that any mistake could be fatal, all combined to create enormous stress. The natural human response to such stress is anxiety and fear, but humans also adapt remarkably well to repeated stressors. What terrifies someone the first time becomes routine after multiple exposures. Bomber pilots flew mission after mission, accumulating experience with various forms of battle damage. Each successful landing built confidence. Each conversation with other pilots who had survived similar circumstances provided reassurance. The emergency procedure that had seemed impossibly difficult the first time gradually became simply another skill in the pilot's repertoire. This psychological adaptation was crucial because bomber operations required it. A tour of duty for a bomber crew in the 8th Air Force was initially set at 25 missions. This number was later increased to 30 missions, then 35. Throughout 1944, the average loss rate varied depending on the target and time period, but it consistently remained high enough that completing a full tour was statistically challenging. Pilots couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear every time they encountered battle damage. The next mission was always coming. The choice was to adapt or to fail, and the men who flew heavy bombers over Germany in 1944 chose to adapt. They mastered techniques that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. They brought home aircraft that by rights should have been lost. And they did it day after day, mission after mission, until either they completed their tour or they didn't come back. The scale of the flak damage problem across the entire 8th Air Force bomber force defies easy comprehension. Consider the statistics from just one bomb group during a representative period. The 91st Bombardment Group, stationed at Bassingbourn, flew missions throughout 1944. Between January and June of that year, the group launched approximately 160 combat sorties. Of the aircraft that returned, more than 70% showed some form of battle damage. The damage ranged from minor, a few holes in non-critical areas, to catastrophic, massive structural damage that made the aircraft barely flyable. Hydraulic system failures occurred on roughly 15% of damaged aircraft. Wing damage severe enough to affect handling characteristics appeared on approximately 20%. Engine damage forcing shutdown and feathering happened on nearly 30% of missions. Each of these damaged aircraft represented a crisis for the crew flying it and a challenge for the pilot landing it. Multiply that across the dozens of bomb groups operating from England, and the scope becomes clear. On any given day, when the 8th Air Force launched a maximum effort mission, hundreds of aircraft would return with damage requiring emergency procedures during landing. The B-17, nicknamed Flak-Bait, a B-26 Marauder that holds the record for most missions flown by an American bomber in Europe, exemplified the punishment these aircraft could absorb. Though a different bomber type, its experience paralleled that of countless B-17 seconds. Over 200 missions, Flak-Bait accumulated more than 1,000 patched holes from flak damage. Twice it returned on a single engine. Multiple times its hydraulic systems were shot out, requiring emergency procedures for landing. It survived everything German air defenses could throw at it, and each time the ground crews patched the holes and sent it back up. Individual B-17 seconds accumulated similar battle scars, Aircraft in the 379th Bomb Group returned with tail sections nearly severed, wings shredded, and cockpit areas destroyed by cannon fire. 1B-17F, nicknamed All-American 3, suffered a mid-air collision with a German fighter that nearly cut the fuselage in half. The rear fuselage swayed in the breeze, connected to the forward section by only a few structural members and control cables. The pilot nursed it home and landed successfully. When ground crews examined the wreckage, they found that one elevator cable, just one, had remained intact and allowed the pilot to maintain control. These weren't anomalies. They were examples of what bomber crews faced regularly throughout the strategic bombing campaign. The difference between survival and death often came down to pilot skill, crew coordination, and the ability to execute emergency procedures under conditions of extreme stress. The training evolution that occurred between 1943 and 1945 demonstrated how quickly military organizations can adapt when forced by circumstances. In early 1943, replacement pilots arriving in England received their emergency procedure training almost entirely from manual study and conversations with experienced crews. By late 1944, the training pipeline had been completely restructured. Combat veterans rotated back to training bases in the United States specifically to pass on their knowledge. These instructors brought with them not just technical skills but hard-won wisdom about what actually worked in combat. They taught student pilots how to assess battle damage in flight, how to compensate for missing control surfaces, how to handle asymmetric thrust from dead engines, and crucially, how to execute no-flap landings when hydraulic systems failed. Training aircraft were deliberately configured to simulate battle damage conditions. Hydraulic systems were disabled, control surfaces were restricted. Students practiced approaches and landings under conditions that approximated what they would face in combat. The training wasn't perfect. No simulation can fully replicate the chaos of actual combat, but it was vastly superior to what earlier classes had received. The technical order manuals were revised based on combat experience. The section on no-flap landings in the 1945 edition of the B-17 Pilot Training Manual included significantly more detail than the 1943 version. It specified precise airspeed targets, described common errors to avoid, and provided guidance on compensating for various combinations of battle damage. The manual had evolved from a theoretical document into a practical guide written in the blood and experience of crews who had actually executed these procedures. Even the physical layout of cockpit controls was revised based on combat experience. Early B-17 models had positioned the landing gear and flap controls very close together, with identical handles. Exhausted pilots returning from 10-hour missions occasionally confused the two, retracting the landing gear instead of the flaps after touchdown. The results were catastrophic. The aircraft would drop onto its belly, propellers striking the ground, engines destroyed, airframe damaged beyond repair. Army Air Forces psychologists Paul Fitz and Alphonse Chapanis investigated the problem and concluded that it wasn't pilot error in the traditional sense. It was design error. The controls were too similar and too close together, setting up exhausted pilots for mistakes. The solution was simple. Different shaped handles. One shaped like a wheel for landing gear, one shaped like a flap for the flap control, and increased separation between them. This modification, along with many others driven by combat experience, appeared on later production aircraft and was retrofitted to earlier models where possible. The human cost of learning these lessons cannot be ignored. Every statistic represents human lives. Every aircraft lost meant 10 men killed, captured, or wounded. Every mission with battle damage meant crews experiencing terror, pain, and loss. The 19-year-old waist gunner wounded by flak fragments, the 23-year-old pilot struggling to control a damaged aircraft with hydraulic fluid spraying in his face, the 21-year-old co-pilot trying to help his wounded pilot while also attempting to fly an aircraft he barely understood. Between August 1942, when the 8th Air Force flew its first mission, and May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the 8th Air Force lost more than 4,700 bombers to all causes. Flak accounted for approximately half those losses, Roughly 26,000 bombers returned to English bases with flak damage serious enough to require extensive repair. But these numbers, staggering as they are, don't capture the individual experiences. They don't convey what it felt like to sit in the pilot's seat of a B-17, approaching the English coast after a mission to Berlin. Hydraulic pressure gauge reading 0. Number 3, engine feathered. Number 2, engine running rough. Fuel gauges showing nearly empty tanks, and a wounded ball turret gunner being tended by the waist gunners in the back. They don't describe the mental calculation every pilot made on final approach without flaps. The judgment of whether he had enough speed to avoid stalling but not so much speed that he couldn't stop before running out of runway. The assessment of wind conditions, approach angle, and touchdown point. The split-second decision of when to reduce power, when to flare, when to touch down. And the prayer, often literal, that the brakes would work when he needed them. First Lieutenant Robert Vance, whose landing opened this story, survived his tour and returned to the United States in late 1944. He trained replacement pilots at Hobbs Army Airfield in New Mexico, teaching them the procedures he had learned in combat. He emphasized emergency procedures, particularly no-flap landings, because he knew from experience how crucial they were. In interviews conducted decades later, Vance recalled that first no-flap landing at Rackheath with remarkable clarity. "I remember thinking that this was it," he said. "Either I got this right, or we were all dead. There wasn't any middle ground." The approach felt wrong because everything was happening so fast. I was used to floating down to the runway with full flaps, nice and controlled. This was just screaming in, hoping I'd judged it right. He paused, then added, "The strange thing was that by June or July it had become routine. We'd come back with flak damage, no hydraulics, and I'd just land it hot. It stopped being scary because it stopped being unusual." That transformation, from terrifying emergency to routine procedure, characterized the entire strategic bombing campaign's evolution. What seemed impossible in 1943 became standard practice by 1944. Pilots adapted, crews adapted. The entire organizational structure of the 8th Air Force adapted to the reality that battle damage was not an occasional emergency, but a constant operational condition. The legacy of this adaptation extended far beyond World War II. The procedures developed for handling battle-damaged aircraft influenced post-war aviation safety protocols. The understanding that emergency procedures needed to be practiced regularly, not just memorized from manuals, shaped how military and civilian pilots were trained for generations. The recognition that cockpit design could set pilots up for errors led to decades of human factors research that made aviation progressively safer. The specific technique of no-flap landings became part of the standard emergency procedures for virtually every aircraft type. Modern pilots train on simulators that can replicate hydraulic failures and force them to execute no-flap landings under controlled conditions. The basic principles established by B-17 pilots over England in 1944 remain fundamentally unchanged. Maintain higher airspeed, plan for longer landing roll, exercise precise control during the final moments before touchdown. But perhaps the most important legacy was cultural rather than technical. The bomber pilots of World War II demonstrated that human beings can adapt to extraordinary circumstances when necessary. They proved that procedures dismissed as too dangerous or too difficult could become routine through practice and determination. They showed that the line between possible and impossible is often simply a matter of necessity and will. Consider the broader context. In early 1943, many aviation experts believed that unescorted daylight bombing raids deep into Germany were infeasible. The losses would be unsustainable. The damage to returning aircraft would ground the force. The psychological toll on crews would make it impossible to maintain operations. By mid-1944, all those predictions had been proven wrong. Not because the predictions were based on faulty analysis, they were actually quite accurate in their assessment of the challenges, but because the pilots and crews found ways to overcome obstacles that experts had considered insurmountable. They learned to fly damaged aircraft. They mastered emergency procedures. They developed tactics that reduced losses. They simply refused to accept that the mission was impossible. The no-flap landing serves as a microcosm of this larger story. It was a procedure that pilots hoped never to use, an emergency that seemed like it would be rare and terrifying. Instead, it became commonplace, almost routine, because circumstances demanded it and pilots adapted. The alternative was failure, and failure meant death. Modern aviation owes an enormous debt to these men. Every safety procedure, every redundant system, every carefully designed cockpit control traces its lineage back to lessons learned when aircraft were simpler and the stakes were measured in human lives rather than insurance costs. The B-17 pilots who brought their battle-damaged aircraft home weren't conducting research studies or writing academic papers. They were trying to survive, but in the process of surviving, they taught the world how to fly damaged aircraft. The morning of March 8, 1944, at Royal Air Force Station Rackheath, when First Lieutenant Robert Vance brought Hell Angel in without flaps at 145 miles per hour, he was doing more than just landing an airplane. He was demonstrating that human skill could compensate for mechanical failure, that training and procedure could overcome battle damage, that survival was possible even when the textbook said it wasn't. 79 years later, pilots around the world train on procedures that evolved from those desperate landings on English runways. They practice no-flap approaches in simulators, they memorize the airspeeds and techniques, they prepare for emergencies that they hope never to encounter, and whether they know it or not, they're following in the flight path of men like Vance, who discovered that impossible simply meant difficult and dangerous rather than unable to be done. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe in World War II accomplished its objectives. German industrial capacity was destroyed, transportation networks were shattered, oil refineries were reduced to rubble. The Third Reich's ability to wage war was systematically dismantled from the air, but the cost was extraordinary. More than 77,000 American and British airmen died in the bombing campaign. Thousands more were wounded or captured. Those men deserve to be remembered not just for what they destroyed, but for what they built. They built procedures that saved lives. They built techniques that made aviation safer. They built a legacy of professionalism and skill that continues to influence how pilots fly today. And they built a record of adaptation under pressure that stands as testament to human resilience. When a modern pilot executes a no-flap landing, whether in an airliner, a military transport, or a small private aircraft, they're using a technique refined over England 8 decades ago. The physics are the same, the challenges are the same, the solution is the same: higher airspeed, precise control, and the confidence that comes from training and practice. But there's one crucial difference. The modern pilot is almost certainly executing that procedure in a controlled environment, probably during training or in response to a mechanical failure rather than battle damage. They have time to prepare, support from air traffic control, emergency services standing by. They face none of the additional challenges that B-17 pilots faced: combat damage to multiple systems, wounded crew members, exhaustion from 10 hours at high altitude, enemy fighters, and the knowledge that this was just one mission of many more to come. The fact that something routine today was once terrifying and desperate speaks to how far aviation has come. It also speaks to how much we owe the men who figured it out when there was no manual, no simulator, no safety net beyond their own skill and determination. Robert Vance passed away in 2003, at the age of 81. His obituary in his hometown newspaper mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, that he had flown B-17 seconds with the 8th Air Force, and that he had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. It didn't mention the morning of March 8, 1944, or the landing without flaps that he and thousands of other pilots mastered. Those stories had become so common, so routine, that they no longer seemed worth mentioning, but they deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered. Because every time a pilot successfully lands an aircraft with damaged or inoperative flaps, they're proving that the lessons learned over England 8 decades ago still matter. The techniques still work, the procedures still save lives, and the legacy of those bomber pilots still flies with us. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.